Today's episode is presented by LodeStar, the fee experts.
Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of LodeStar's Lending Leaders. I'm really excited to dive into our topic today. We have with us Laird Nossuli, CEO at iEmergent. And iEmergent, Laird will describe this a lot better than me, but they basically leverage data to identify diverse lending opportunities, even more important in this market right now. Laird, thanks so much for coming on. We'd love to, hear about your journey to this industry and the types of problems you're solving at iEmergent, or Emergent, as you originally called the company.
Well, thanks, Jim. I'm happy to be here, and you'll find that this is a topic I can talk a lot about.
Great. So what got you interested in solving the problem of how to address, lending opportunities outside of what's considered mainstream?
Yeah, so as I think some people may know, Emergent was actually founded 20 years ago by my dad. And he was an executive at Wells Fargo, sort of a chief change maverick of a thinker. So it wasn't, he was dealing with what they used to call emerging markets, the diverse market group back then, and working on a lot of issues in terms of how to think ahead. And, it came to a point where he and the rest of the executive team didn't see eye to eye on doing that. So he decided to leave and start iEmergent. And when he did, he didn't really, he was a really, like I said, a brilliant thinker, but not much of a sales guy. And so he just kind of thought he'd start iEmergent and people would come. But really the beginning of it was starting to think about how to think ahead and, make forward-looking decisions, which, in a transactional industry is a little bit harder to do. And as he was out there consulting, he realized that there was this big gap in the type of information that was available. So how can you think ahead and make good strategic decisions if there's no data to support it? So he went back to the drawing board for a number of years, and he did have a background in predictive modeling from earlier years, and so he spent 2 years really working on a forecast methodology that is now for 15 years has been our kind of what we do. That's a really unique value proposition, and part of that was being able to project where loans and dollars will be down to the census tract level of detail, and of course also becoming broader and starting to look at different segments. So enter me as newly graduated MSW, Masters in Social Work candidate, who came back to Iowa to help her dad in 2007, started the company. Obviously, the market crashed at the end of 2007. Emergent lost about 85% of its revenue overnight, and suddenly here we were. And we crawled back up, and we're really still focused on just that overall growth issue. And then in 2009, my father was diagnosed with a terminal lung disease, and he had a lung transplant on February 1st, 2014, and overnight I became CEO. So he had to be in Rochester for at Mayo Clinic for a whole year. So that's when I started taking over. Unfortunately, my dad had a lot of challenges that he couldn't overcome, and so we lost him in March of 2016. But so in a sense, he'd always been talking about emerging markets and the importance, especially after the collapse, about how you have to really value community and stop thinking in terms of loan units and dollars and think in terms of families and those kinds of things. So it was always in his vision that way. But for me, it really became an opportunity to start seeing and bringing another, my whole community development background to the table, hit on the core values of iEmergent in the first place. But it also really aligned in the last 3 years with the direction that the market is going. Okay. So, I will be honest with you, 2020, started having more business in 2021. Our company exploded in 2022, and now we've tripled our client count in 7 months. A lot of that has to do with this sort of what I call the trifecta of opportunities, right? We've got a demographic world where basically 77% of all net household growth came from non-Hispanic or non-Hispanic white people. So, we have them, but like I like to just use my hands for this, but the population, the household formation is going up with minority groups. But on the other hand, the homeownership gap that's been in place for decades is actually widening. I don't know how many people realize that, but despite everything we've been doing to work on this issue for the past decade, it's clearly not working because that gap just widens. And so you think about that happens is you've got this, divergence of where the market's going and how well you can serve that market. Add in a really challenging year when business isn't coming out of the walls, and a regulatory environment that's stronger. And suddenly our value proposition and what we started building with Market Smart 3 years ago is really attractive. So it wasn't like by surprise that that we're in this place. We saw this position coming. We are forecasters, and we decided to kind of in our own world pair our interest with what the market needed. And so that's kind of where we are now, and why, my path to this initially maybe had been on more the nonprofit side. So in all the community development work I've done, I've realized that nothing happens if the financial institutions aren't at the table. And so that's why, for me, my path to this is giving lenders tools and support so that they can get to that table and become empowering and agents of positive change, if you will.
Yeah. So I think that's amazing. And I always like to say people either stumble into this industry or are born into it. This seems like we're both in the latter category. I grew up in a family-owned title company, so I saw during the Great Recession that company go from 90 employees to 20, right? So I've lived a lot of those similar situations. And that's the reason they were my first client, right? That was where I started. So I've had a very, very similar path. And use of that resonates. And it's really cool too, seeing like when you first hear, social work, what does that have to do with the mortgage industry? And then by the end of you just describing it here, right, it's just so tied together, I think, in the community building. And when I'm, the times I've been at the family title company and seeing the office, it's always really touching to see someone come in and close on a home, right? Because you're dealing with units, you're dealing with numbers. I'm selling a calculator here for Pete's sake, right? But you actually see what it means to someone to go in and buy a home, and that how important that is. So it really puts it into a context that I think is really good. And you said something, Laird, about like bringing the financial institutions to the table. So one of the things that has come up a lot when we talk about different topics is, the quote unquote right thing to do and the thing that helps your business can be the same, right? And I saw a LinkedIn post of yours saying the dichotomy between diverse lending and profits. So how do you get people to realize, hey, what's good for communities is also good for your business?
Well, I think in this particular case, the data don't lie, right? I mean, it's a pretty strong case to make when you see the household formation look like it looks.
Yeah.
About 2 years ago, the MBA asked me to become a national partner in their Convergence initiative, initially in Memphis. And they asked me to speak, and I, for the first time, prepared what I call the Tale of Two Futures for Memphis. And I calculated opportunity in Memphis with the status quo lending. And I calculated opportunity, meaning like loans in dollars over the next 5 years in Memphis, which what I called the new paradigm, the better way of doing things, right? And it really is a difference in how do you look at diversity? Is it central? Is it peripheral? Are we thinking ahead, or are we looking reactively? There's six different components to it. Sure. But when I calculated that and I identified the difference in billions of dollars in just Memphis, the lenders perked up at that. And then suddenly, like, I had people coming up to me saying, hey, that's great how you're looking at it. Can you tell me more? So I just started doing more and more thinking about that issue. And again, not every problem out there has the data supporting it like this one does, right? So there's one on the supply. I call that the demand side. That's a demand side help. If you can take the problem and show people very, very clearly what's in it for them, dollar-wise, that makes sense. But there's another side of that, and that's that the industry has long time been plagued with, really high attrition rates, buying each other's loan officers. It's not always been the most strategic and long-term thinking. So one of the things that's a problem in just it's inherent in an industry where this is how you're paid. When you start thinking about the short, intermediate, and long-term strategies, like the long game versus the sprint, that starts making it easier as well. And you start talking about, okay, well, let's say you have a borrower, a potential borrower calls you on the phone and they're not ready today. They're just like their credit score is too low, or they don't have cash for close, but whatever the issue is, and you say, sorry, not today. Okay, you lose that, that person, you leave them on the homeownership journey. Let's say you say, you know what, not yet, right?
Right.
And then you end up, finding this customer. And the interesting thing, not really interesting, but the reality is that for diverse and historically underserved markets, there's three things that are keeping them: a trust gap, an education gap, and a finance and credit gap. Mm-hmm. And if you think about those three gaps and you start helping fill those, that trust gap is one of the most important ones. And if you're the first institution that finally makes them feel comfortable, that finally believes in their ability to be home ownership, they don't forget that. They're extremely loyal, and it becomes, one person that you help becomes 4 prospects, and that just builds. And so if we start thinking about this in the same way that, the industry thinks about, building a realtor base, it starts to be language that they understand. Yeah. Then you throw in, after the great part though is after they start going through what you talked about, when you go in and you see someone close on a home, when they start thinking about and seeing that the value that they're bringing to families, I believe, it's emotional for me to think about and watch, but I start seeing a change in mindset. Yeah. I start saying, what can we do instead of what should we do? Mm-hmm. And, like one of my clients is Fifth Third, and they have a great tagline that said, "A family, not a file." Yeah. And I think that is the mindset. Again, I think change is hard, but when you give people tools, you support them, and you show them both that business value and the social or emotional value of it, it ends up not being a very hard sell.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it makes sense. Obviously the data is one thing. I'm an engineer by education, love looking at numbers, love looking at data. But how do you put it into practice at the end of the day? So, I feel like this is something you see a lot of people do poorly, right? So the data's there. Okay, we know we want more Hispanic, Latino families coming in. So, hey, se habla español, put on everything we do, done, problem solved, right? Like, how do you actually implement a plan to address, the three components there, the trust, the education, the finance? Like, once someone goes through the step of being like, Laird, okay, I get that there's data here. I get that this is an opportunity. How are we putting this into practice?
Right. Oh, and that's the great thing is that one of my favorite quotes is, without strategy, execution is pointless. Mm-hmm. And without execution, strategy is aimless. Mm-hmm. I love that because that sort of reflects, for me, my very, very fast and volatile learning curve as someone running a business and trying to sell it and create a product. We have over time had to make market smart, right? Yeah. We had to, I kind of assumed at the beginning that if I gave people the data, they would know what to do with it. It's not that they don't know what to do with it. It's an entirely new way of thinking about it, right? And so part of that, is just putting the data together. One of the things that we've added in the past 2 years was initially we had focused on our forecast because nobody else does that. As a business, you like to talk about your unique value proposition. But going back to that quote, I had so many clients like, this is great data. It's a nice to have, not a need to have. What can I do with it, Laird? What can I do with it? So we started bringing in the real-time MLS listing. We started bringing in county recorder data. We started bringing in the locations of churches and libraries and hospitals and a whole bunch of different things to suddenly make that data really actionable. The complicated part, though, is that the problems and the situation behind the problem is really complicated, right? I mean, we're looking at, and I was just doing research in St. Louis over the weekend, we're looking at, decades of housing covenants, historically, like the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the beginning of redlining starting in 1915, to 1940-ish. You're looking at history that has prevented home ownership in a huge group of people, right? And so that has created this issue with, the gap's not just in housing, it's in education, it's in health, and it's in wealth. So you add all those things together and it can seem overwhelming. Can a lender really work on the fact that a particular prospect has a $35,000 median income? Not really. But when you start taking that data apart and you look at, okay, let's say, for example, we use the HMDA data and we think about, okay, it looks like, cutoff scores, we can't do anything under a 700. You start thinking about, well, what can we do? So you add that incremental risk and you start thinking about very targeted strategies instead of really generic ones. Like there is no diverse market strategy, right? We've had people say, well, I just need someone that speaks Asian. And that, go back to the drawing, like, okay, we have to start from the beginning. Let's talk about what that means. Let's talk about the difference in marketing to, young people who are on the internet and maybe need a homeowner happy hour, and older people that are really connected to their churches. Let's move beyond finding new realtors and getting the best loan officers. Those are important. Don't get me wrong, but those don't work if you have the wrong product. You can have the perfect product, but if you don't have anyone going into the community, talking, seeing how people feel, that doesn't work. And so it really goes back to, how do you create a comprehensive strategy that's thinking about all these pieces at the same time, that you're thinking about all the things that have caused the problem in the first place.
And what are different about you mentioned the, trust, education, finance. So in the financial piece, what are different about those products that a lender may not be doing before they start to talk to you? Like what changes at that tactical level are being made?
Well, I think, and one of the things that we're working on a lot, in fact, it's kind of another explosive part of the business, is helping lenders, build and execute special purpose credit programs. And, SPCPs, they're in the news, everyone's talking about them, they've been in place for decades. But I think what I like about them can really be applied to any good strategy, is that you have to do your homework. You have to go in and use data, determine a need, see what you might need to do to fill that need, figure out a way to evaluate it, constantly evaluate it, design an execution plan. So in a way, by that, the recommendations from the CFPB to put together this written plan, they're kind of, it's a pain, but it's also helping protect the success of that strategy, right? So I think SPCPs, by opening up the, making it so that, ECOA isn't in the way, it's opposite, then they realize, okay, I'm not going to necessarily get my hand slapped for doing something different for a protected class if I can show that protected class needs that extra support because it's not, we haven't been able to serve them equally.
Right.
That whole way of thinking is a great place to start.
Right. And I would think that whole way of thinking would be very difficult when rates are 2.75 and refis are falling out of the sky, right? You had mentioned that the changes over the last year and the increased demand. Obviously, the slowdown in the market and the increased competition, I would think, is driving them. But has overall attitudes? How have overall attitudes changed when folks look at different markets?
Well, they don't have time. If the market's really great, there's not time. With the exception of the people who are the neighborhood lending executives, the CRA institution, the CRA LOs, the CRA managers, the executives who are focused on that, their commitment to this never changes. And it's fantastic. I mean, they're amazing how committed they are. As an organization, though, I think that, you know, what is it? What do they say? Like a problem is the greatest whatever of innovation. There's a quote that just basically gets to the fact that when you have a problem, you start to have a solution. And that problem is we don't have any opportunity. At the same time, though, we saw early on, like in 2018, 2017, when profitability is a challenge and they're losing money on every loan, trying to go out there and get more loans when you're losing money on every loan doesn't make a lot of sense. So there has to be like this perfect time. And I think now is that time to start that process of short, intermediate, and long term. But I think what I see people doing, and I'll be honest, we prepared for things slowing down for us, because I know a lot of vendors or technology providers to lenders are seeing some cutback.
Yeah.
Not. And I think the reason for that is that it's an understanding that you can't wait anymore. Tomorrow is here. These markets aren't emerging anymore. They've emerged.
Yeah.
And we don't know how to help
them.
I think that driver is strong. And I think that overcomes some of the fears with some institutions. There are still some out there that are really like, oh, we can't spend any money. We can't do this. But I think the majority of them are looking more long term. And it helps us because when we can show them the data and they can start thinking ahead, they're like, okay, if we really want to be in business 5-10 years from now, how are we going to put in place today the strategies we need for tomorrow? And I think that's what's driving so much of it.
And in communities where that gap gets closed, right, where these practices come into place, there's lenders, giving affordable home access. What changes? What does that start to look like?
I'm going to be a little bit negative here and tell you we haven't had a community have that yet. Fair as enough. A whole, right?
Yeah.
It is going to be a slow process. The home ownership, the widest black-white home ownership gap of the top 100 MSAs is actually in Minneapolis. 50.1% housing home ownership gap there, which is, that's enormous.
Yeah.
So that's just telling you how wide it is. There is not a metropolitan area where there's not a gap between the home ownership rate for Black families or Black individuals or non-Hispanic white. There are a couple where Hispanic and white is really close, but nowhere is the gap closed. So you have to start looking. Everyone's always said lending is local, right? Yeah. So you have to start looking at local communities and start looking for local wins. And I believe it starts with one lender at a time, starting to do a good job with a certain group of people, a certain neighborhood, set of community. One lender helping people start to feel like they can trust lenders again is the first step toward 2 people, then 4, then 8. And that trust gap is not something that's really competitive in nature for lenders. And so one of the things I try to tell our clients is, a lot of them are competing with each other, but they're not really. Why not? There's shared risk models. There's a whole bunch of different things they could do if they look at each other and say, it doesn't really matter who has the right product. It matters that home buyer isn't left behind. That's the message that is actually going to change things. And I've seen that with some, we're starting to see some lenders say, hey, you know what? We don't have a product that'll help you, but let me connect you to Thrive Mortgage. They do. Or, whomever that is, that mindset, starting to look at this as a kind of a shared responsibility is going to help with that trust gap. And I think for the trust gap, that's the biggest thing, right? The education gap, boy, we're learning that education is exactly what it sounds like it is. But there's one piece that we don't talk about, which is professionals educating professionals. Like we did a real estate professional survey, and they get most of their information on product from loan officers. And yet when we did this survey, the gaps in the lack of knowledge they had about knowing about all the down payment assistance programs out there was huge. And so instead of just saying, hey, let's connect, Mr. Realtor, teach, educate. Here's how we can together help this group of people.
And you know what, coming at it like that and teaching someone and giving them skills that are going to help them is a lot better than saying, hey, can we talk? Can I take you out for lunch? You know, can I bring a box of donuts to your office? Right? It's you're providing value at the end of the day. And as you know, folks in sales, I feel like that's always the approach is I just want to help you solve a problem that you have. If you don't have this problem, fine, we don't need to talk, right? Like but it seems like in your case, it's very much everywhere. So, you know, really appreciate your time. It always goes by too fast. So to kind of be a good steward of your time here, the last question that we have of all of our guests is, what is your LodeStar? What is your kind of guiding light? What inspires you to go out and do this work every day?
All right, promise not to get emotional here, okay? Two big pieces. One is on the internal side, my team, not just, you know, the people, like the 4 people that work with us, family. We have some really, really amazing vendors that, you know, we've really struggled for 2 decades. To start seeing success and see people put their trust in you over and over again is really meaningful. That's number one. Number 2, though, I have to give a shout out to most of the people I work with who are in those diverse lending markets, who are in the nonprofit sector. 80% of them are people of color. They come to work, they do the hard work, and honestly, the attitude, the interest, the energy they put to it is humbling every single day. And I just feel lucky that like they let me be at the table helping with them, because I mean the years of stuff, if you will, that people have had to face, it's almost overwhelming and impossible to think about. And yet they come to the table, they come to the, you know, to work every day, and they keep trying to think about new things. And they're probably the biggest inspiration. I can't name just one because there's like one in every institution, one in every market, you know, 10. But they're amazing.
No, that's, I mean, uplifting and great to see that. Like, it's a problem that's so gigantic when you think about it. You look at things like appraisal gaps and, you know, all these other issues that happen and what can go into someone's credit score that, you know, takes place over years and years and years. So I think the fact that folks like yourself are out there and people you work with chipping away is, you know, super, super uplifting. So I think it's a great note to end on.
Well, and Jim, one thing, you have to give yourself some credit. Keep focusing on this issue, on, you know, this is a type of education. I love that you cared enough to have me on, and I hope that you continue to keep the industry, the issue front and center. So thank you for the work you do too.
Oh, I mean, it's absolutely. And I think it's, you know, it's not mutually exclusive. These are things that help your business at the end of the day, and they can help people too. And when you get that alignment, I think that's when things are the most powerful. You know, we're not, you know, there's obviously a charitable involvement in a lot of things that you're doing, but at the same time, like, these are things that can very much drive your business forward. So whether it be diverse lending, whether it be diversity, equity, inclusion, your own workforce, like, people aren't up here on their high horse. They're doing it because it's going to help your business at the end of the day. So,
and that's okay, right? That's what we say that, hey.
No, that's what you need. That's the only way you're going to have long-term positive change, and that's fine. But like, you just have to, it takes a lot of work to identify that sometimes. And, you know, it takes a lot of work to, you know, figure out, oh, there's a special purpose credit program, which I had never heard of before today, right? Like, you know, it still takes work because it's hard. It's not the easy thing to do. And, you know, in good markets, people want to do the easy thing. And I think we're not in a good market right now. So, you know, hopefully the traction that people get, you know, in this market really helps to close that gap in the future.
I agree. It'll be, I'm proud of where everything's going for the industry. I'm proud that it's moving forward when it should be.
Well, Laird, thank you so much for coming on. Where can folks find you if anyone is interested?
I'm not good at this. You can go to our website. It's www.iEmergent.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I love to talk, help, and think about these things. I have a team who'd love to show you any demos of our products, but we love to hear from lenders. We love to hear from community groups. As many minds on this problem as possible is great. So love to hear from anybody.
Great. Thanks so much for coming on again. It was a pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Jimmy. It was a pleasure for me too.
Thank you for listening to LodeStar's Lending Leaders. Please like, subscribe, and rate us 5 stars anywhere you get your podcast. I'd like to give a special thank you to the LodeStar team involved with the production of this podcast, including Elena Gardner, Kim Austin, and John Gardner.